Well, good morning, everyone. We got the niceties out of the way, said hello and shook hands and everything else, and so why don't we begin? It's not we're not here to talk about the state fair, are we, Deb?
Not today.
Okay, all right. So, Madam Clerk, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just start us off with an overview about what today's meeting's about, and those of the public who are here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a reminder, today's meeting is an informal presentation meeting. As there are no votes being cast and only presentations, we will not be taking any public comment. We have moved the meeting to this location to allow for additional seating if needed. However, if you do have comments that you would like to share, please feel free to email us at clerkboard, all one word, at mail.maricopa.gov. And if I did that too quickly and you need one later, we do have some slips up here with that email address if you are interested.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. And to my colleagues, anything at the outset? Or if not, we are on a tight time frame. Time is a commodity, as we all know, and we have an executive session beginning at 11 a.m. So I do appreciate our auditors being here. I certainly appreciate the Elections Department and Mr. Fontes for being here this morning. And Mr. Fontes, with that, I'll have you come up. And if I could preface just by saying, you know, what we're here for today is really just to ensure the best possible outcome we can have on November 6th. And I think it's that spirit of cooperation and collaboration that we are all working together to ensure that our Maricopa County residents have a good experience come November 6th, and we don't have some of the issues that we experienced at our primary election. So with that, Mr. Fontes, thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the board, I'm going to go ahead and get right into it, and we do have, so I'll just go ahead. I've got some prepared remarks here. As we approach the 2018 general election, it's important that we look back at the significant improvements that have been made in the administration of elections in Maricopa County. But because there's so much interest in the entire workings of the department, I'm going to be thorough in my presentation. So I'll have some general background stuff at the beginning, and we'll get into the meat of it momentarily. Written copies of these remarks will be made available for members of the press. They're being printed off right now. This general election, there will be 2.2 million eligible voters in Maricopa County. Since taking office in January 2017, voter registration has increased by a net of 61,000 voters. It doesn't seem like a lot, but list maintenance requires such a thing. 62,000 net increase comes at a very high volume of work, however, for our voter registration staff. Hundreds of thousands more transactions have to be research processed and updated addresses to make voters who move around into an active or canceled status, and to add information for our database. Since January, our voter registration staff has processed 538,000 transactions for our voter file, and despite this workload, for the first time we've increased and completed the task of processing every single new modified voter registration request prior to the deadline for requesting early ballots. And so we're well on track there. In the most recent year, for example, April 2018 through September 2018, our office has processed 117,221 new registrants, 22,900 plus on by paper, 31,000 servicearizona.com, and 62,996 at motor vehicle division offices. All that work happened in a year, as you know, where the same department had a significant increase in the amount of candidate challenges, 74 candidate challenges, 12 initiatives and recalls, hundreds of thousands of petition signatures hand verified to determine whether the signer was eligible. Additionally, our staff helped to prepare legal paperwork, testify in court cases, and our voter registration staff has also had to hand check all of the clean elections contributions. Right now, we're employing 42 temporary voter registration staff into a division that has been working 12-hour days for at least 6 days a week since May. As an aside, please don't be surprised if you see some budget requests to support some increase in staffing and IT side to streamline this part of the operation and to make things more efficient. Maricopa County is growing. The long and short of voter registration is that we're still working on the daily requests for changes of address and other work that comes into the division. This is a good time to segue now into current ballot processing. This is where human resource management is critical. As you know, the vast majority of our voters vote by mail. 85% of our voters cast ballots by mail in early voting in the primary election. Each one of those ballot envelopes meets a high level of scrutiny before we open them. So where the voter registration work is subsiding, the ballot processing work is already increasing. We've mailed out 1.61 million ballots to people on the permanent early vote list and continue to get one-time requests for early ballots via our website and the Star Call Center hotline. Friday's numbers have us over 250,000 ballots. 250,000 ballots have already been returned, and we finished up signature verification on those over the weekend. So we're well into this election. The work presently presents only a small portion of the total that we're dealing with daily, and we will continue this part of our work through and past Election Day. Now, some of the increased workload falls under the area of ballot processing. Now, this is processing on the backside once we've received these ballots for tabulation. Some of the last few cycles, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the department shut off the safeties on the C400 tabulators for overvotes. The impact of shutting off these safeties is that ballots with stray marks on them, which can be misread by the counting machines as overvotes in some races, are automatically rejected as overvotes. For example, if a voter uses a Sharpie, it often bleeds through the paper and shows up as a stray mark on the opposite side of the ballot. It's not an overvote, but the machine may misread it as such. Once I was made aware of the situation, we resumed the more historic practice of using those safety mechanisms to outstack those ballots that had extra marks so that we could have counting and have a bipartisan central board research them by hand to determine if the error was actually an overvote or a stray mark. Resuming this practice not only allows us to capture an estimated 50,000 more votes this fall, but it will return us to nationally recognized best practice. So that's a good thing. This will, of course, force us to hand process about 100,000 more ballots, which isn't easy work, but we've got a staffing plan in place to meet these goals, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, including the repurposing of some of our voter registration temps for this purpose when the voter registration work is done. And that's why I talked about that earlier, to show how we're flowing folks from different areas into other areas. Now let me jump into the act of elections from the front end, and now this is what we call where we directly interact with the voters. We've already had healthy turnout for in-person voters and early ballots returned in person. We anticipate that as we open more and more vote centers, our volume will increase. Our heaviest sites are processing a couple hundred voters per day right now, but again, this volume is increasing. As a side note, I've initiated a project to open 4 vote centers around the county to accommodate a Souls to the Polls program for religious organizations, houses of worship, and others to promote. We're open from 1 to 5 p.m. on Sunday, October 28th. This is after most services are done at the following locations: Thunderbirds Arts Center in far north Phoenix, the Election Department office in Mesa at Mesa Drive in the US 60, the Avondale City Hall out in the West Valley, and the Burton Bar Library to cover our central core voters. I'd like to take time to thank all of our vote center workers and others who have agreed to work on Sunday to increase voter access. Beyond that, we'll have all 40 vote centers open on Wednesday, October 31st, November 1st, and 2nd to accommodate those people who want to vote early right before Election Day. We're encouraging as many people to vote as early as possible as we expect record turnout throughout Election Day. I encourage the public to visit locations.maricopa.vote to find their vote center for hours of operation. Please take a moment to make a plan and to vote. And now on Election Day planning and progress. On Saturday, September the 1st, I assembled my senior management team and others in the election department to review the successes and identify the areas of improvement for the August 28th primary election. We were in agreement that the record turnout, being 25% more voters than we had just 2 years ago, and the speed with which we overcame significant challenges, really did speak to a story of success, including the speed with which we closed the election, which was exactly the same amount of time as 2 years ago. We decided to reorganize, nonetheless, the department in a way that would match the needs that we identified and that we have discussed in length. In that meeting, we realized that the department, in spite of recent additions, was still severely understaffed. We reorganized our staffing to create a project manager for this election, and I assigned the entire community relations team, members of my policy team, and others from different areas to assist that individual however she needed it. I put a hard stop on all of that staff's normal and regularly planned activities, and they were dedicated to planning for the general election alone. I directed the entire institution to focus directly on November's election while maintaining other minimal statutory duties that we are required to maintain and fulfill. At that September 1st meeting, we identified that staffing and training were the most important issues. We developed a plan for setting up polling places on our own as our top priority. Now let me be clear, about this idea of setting up polling places, because that's really the crux of what we're here to talk about. Our original plan, going back several months, was to have our inspectors and troubleshooters do the work before Election Day. The practice in past years was to have Election Day workers set up all the equipment, even the more technical equipment, such as the old e-poll books, the tabulation machines, the Edge alternative format voting machines, and so forth. In fact, there was much internal discussion back and forth in the spring and early this summer about the necessity of incurring the cost of using a contractor for equipment setup, but worrying that the work was too technical for our own folks and wanting to ensure that the setup went well with minimal technical problems, we decided to hire a contractor. Our caution was rewarded, as you've seen me assert, with a material breach of contract, but our original plan was validated. Troubleshooters and Election Day workers who have taken the training have overwhelmingly indicated to us that they are comfortable with the equipment setup. And many of them actually ended up troubleshooting the equipment themselves on primary Election Day. So this transition year has yet another lesson learned. When you have thousands of people working with a system for the first time, you're going to have a bumpy start. Thankfully, in November, every polling place will have at least one person present who worked the election in August. The reception we've received from our inspectors and judges regarding our augmented training has been nothing short of phenomenal. In all, we'll be hiring nearly 4,000 people to make November 2018 a success. This includes 6 workers at each polling place and 240 vote center workers who will still be working vote centers on Election Day, as they have done since early voting began in some cases. We will nearly double the number of troubleshooters we have available on Election Day to handle any issues which may arise. Currently, we have 88% of our Election Day poll workers hired, and 95 of the 125 troubleshooters are confirmed. This is a bank of potential workers being recruited as we speak to fill the empty slots. We are on pace, hitting our internal recruiting and hiring benchmarks to have the workers we need in place by Friday, November 2nd, to support all our Election Day activities. As for setting up polling locations, most of the locations will be set up by troubleshooters or the inspector assigned to the location. Additionally, our request for county employees to volunteer has yielded more than enough extra workers to help with this task. It has also yielded individuals with technical background who will serve as IT troubleshooters, on call to be dispatched to locations as needed to address more complicated technical issues, either during setup or on Election Day. In fact, we had over 450 county employees respond to our request for volunteers. Some will be helping with equipment setup, but many have agreed to be polling place workers. The support shown from their fellow county employees has been a huge morale boost for the Elections Department staff and is frankly much appreciated. So, shout out to the county employees. I'd like to personally thank all of them who volunteered to help, and of course, our county manager for helping grease the skids on all of that. Now, to further help ensure that we minimize problems first thing in the morning on Election Day, every site will be open to our staff at 5 a.m. instead of 5:30 a.m. This will allow for an extra half hour before the doors open to voters to run tests on the equipment, which will have already been tested the day before, and ensure that the whole operation is prepared by 6 a.m. when voting at each of these sites begins. Along with a significant increase in troubleshooters, we're deploying a network of support hubs with IT troubleshooters. This is a next level up. Supplies, extra site books, and other equipment all around Maricopa County. The quick deployment of stuff and staff will help our polling locations experience the shortest amount of time for return to service if we do experience any issues at any of our locations. Of significant importance is the ongoing development of a monitoring system that will give us a real-time look at what is happening in every polling place. Now, this is facilitated by our site books, and I'll be happy to brief you on some of the very particular improvements in our monitoring capabilities in a closed setting, but for security reasons, I'm going to refrain from describing the whole setup to you right now. There is one aspect of the system, however, that the public should be made aware of, and this is incredibly important. We have developed the ability to monitor the length of our voting lines in every single polling location in Maricopa County in real time. To our knowledge, this is the first time in the history of American elections where a department has internally created real-time information about the length of voting lines in every polling location in the entire jurisdiction that we will have live information for. Our sitebook check-in system is the foundation for this new capacity. Here's how it works. Each hour on the hour, the marshal for each polling location will take one of the lanyards that we will have prepared. Did we bring one of those lanyards? No, we didn't. Oh, well, it's got a QR code on it. It's really nice. And they'll scan it on the sitebook. The marshal will then take the lanyard to the last voter in line, whether it's 2 voters or 200 voters, and ask them to scan it again when they get to the front of the line. The back of the lanyard will have a little explanation about why we're doing this. This will give us real-time monitoring capabilities for every single location. Now, let's say 30 minutes pass between the top of the hour and the last person scanning the QR code. That lets us know, without having to bother poll workers, how long the line is. If it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 45 minutes from the first scan to the second scan. If our system shows lines forming and wait times increasing, we'll be able to call the polling place and ask if things are going well. We can respond immediately with backup equipment or staff as necessary before the situation builds into something untenable. Now, we all know that the 6 a.m. hour is usually very busy, but we've never had the capacity to actually see it in action, live, as it's happening on a dashboard that we can monitor at the warehouse. Now we can do that, and we will this November. This is one of the clearest indications that our entire process is focusing on the voter experience, on accountability, and on security, which has been the 3 pillars of this administration from the beginning. As for staffing, training, and quality of locations, that we are well on our way to making all of the appropriate adjustments. We're using the same polling place map and all but one of the same locations, and we had a request to make one of those changes, and we fulfilled that. We've evaluated each location's room capacity, workflow, and connectivity, and we've adjusted accordingly as needed to make sure that we have sufficient space for the larger numbers of voters that we anticipate will need to be processed. We have a high percentage of the same staff coming back that we used in August, and we are in a place where these workers are now familiar with the site books and the processes that are to be used when they are working with voters. We're requiring all troubleshooters, inspectors, judges, IT troubleshooters, and any other people helping to set up our equipment to attend in-person upgraded training. As we are requiring the troubleshooters, inspectors, and judges to also take the online training, which has also been significantly revamped, that the marshals and the clerks take to create more continuity within the polling place team. They'll all have the same information. We've clarified in our training the processes and procedures for addressing emergency situations. We'll move to a more proactive system of communicating from the command center to troubleshooters and inspectors at polling place sites to ensure that contingency measures, including check-in of voters offline with the site books if necessary, and the use of paper rosters in emergencies, that those are being implemented as needed if they are needed. Ultimately, we will still have 40 vote centers in place to handle overflow. The overflow needed if a particular polling place is, for whatever reason, not operable. And we have worked with our legal team to make it clear through training and the information provided on the site book screens that voters at vote centers are not voting, quote, provisionally, close quote, but rather an out-of-precinct ballot, which is valid and will be counted like any regular ballot. In all, this election will present some challenges. Every election does. But we do expect a significantly higher of voters to vote on Election Day as well. Now, let me repeat. Early voting will alleviate Election Day challenges for the office and for voters, and it's already available all over Maricopa County. This election will likely break turnout records for a midterm election, and we are ready to meet all of those challenges. That's the formal part, and I guess if you have questions,
I'm sure there will be. Thank you
All right.
very much, Mr. Fontes. If you could stay there, Mr. Fontes, I think what we'll do is have questions before inviting Mr. McGee and others up to keep this flowing. I would also like to note that, unfortunately, Mr. Gardo is sick today, but he is here by phone. And Steve, I just want to make sure you can hear us okay. Okay. Well, thank you, and we hope you feel better soon. With that, I'm going to turn it to my Vice Chairman, Mr. Gates, to start with questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Fontes, for joining us today, and thanks for that thorough report. Very, very helpful, both for the board and I think for the whole community. Question about, I appreciate you mentioned that you've had about 450 county employees who have indicated that they would like to help on Election Day. Have those folks been contacted? Have they been assigned their duties? And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you most effectively utilize those people and their skills.
So this is an ongoing process that we began right after we got sort of the ball rolling, right? We had to make sure that through the processes in HR we could we have to pay everybody that works for us, that we could make sure to take care of all of those technical questions. We have been contacting day in and day out all of the folks that are going to be fulfilling the variety of different roles, whether it's poll workers, whether it's IT professionals, whether it's folks who are going to be filling roles from the county into troubleshooters or from the county into poll workers. Those contacts are ongoing, so not every single county employee that's been that contacted us has been contacted by phone, but we have sent out notices to all of them thanking them for getting back to us and that their assignments will be forthcoming. So assigning 4,000 people and onboarding 4,000 people is not a simple task. We've got to make sure we've got everybody in the right places with the right skill set. So that is an ongoing task, and again, we are meeting all of our internal goals as we move forward.
Like, Mr. Chairman, like what percentage of those county employees would you say have been contacted at this point?
That specific number I couldn't tell you, but overall, I think we mentioned about 80% on general hiring. But because we've got 4 different spaces where we're hiring people into, one of them is central boards back at the warehouse, one of them is our county employees that are going up to do IT setup, one of them is our polling place folks, and another one is sort of our general technical folks that are going to be available on Election Day, and early voting folks, things of this nature. So we've got sort of 4 different tracks of hiring that are happening. The folks that are coming to us from the county are falling into all 4 of those areas, so I couldn't give you an exact number just for that category of folks.
And Mr. Chairman, you spoke generally about kind of the staffing plan. Yep. In general. Can you give us put a little bit more meat on the bone, specifically what the staffing plan is for Election Day?
Absolutely. So we're looking at, again, these 4 different areas that we're addressing very specifically. Number 1, we've got our poll place workers. We've got a broad network of folks that have worked with Maricopa County elections for years and years and years. That is the core of our Election Day polling place workers staff. A lot of those folks, in fact, the majority of the ones we're contacting, worked with us in August and have had that very recent experience making sure that voters get through with the equipment that we're using. So that's a big voter contact portion of the employees that we're bringing on board. Now, insofar as the portion of folks that we're using a lot of our county employees for is the IT setup. Now, these aren't necessarily IT troubleshooters, although some of them will be doing that job. These are the several hundred folks who are not only working on Election Day, are troubleshooters and inspectors, but these inspectors are really the one individual who is most responsible for setting up the polling place on Election Day. The judges as well are substitute inspectors in case something happens to the inspectors, so they'll also be part of that training group, so that they'll have that same training.
So
our hiring is...
Sorry for interrupting. I just want to make sure I understand this end. So the tech people who will be doing setup the day before, they're also going to be available on Election Day? This is going to be the same universe of people?
To a degree, yes. So we have our T-techs, we've got our troubleshooters, who are sort of more of a technical layer, and then we've got our inspectors and our judges. That's the inspector who is really in charge of each of our polling places, and that's kind of how it's always been. And as I indicated, in the past, that person was responsible for the entire polling place setup and so forth. We're going back to that plan because what we've discovered is setting up the site books is really not, in fact, I think one of the experiences that our outside auditors had was setting up the site books is less complicated than setting up the the polling place tabulators that we have. So, and they've been through that training. They'll probably talk a little bit about that. So these inspectors who've dealt with the equipment are really going to be the key responsible folks, along with the judges who are the substitute inspectors. These are the people who are going to be setting up as many sites as we could get access to Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday as well. So we've got a complete plan set up. We've contacted every single one of our polling places. We have a scheduled opening for them to get in there. And then because we've increased the number of troubleshooters significantly, there are less polling places per troubleshooter. So the troubleshooter will be going around to their smaller number of polling places on Monday to verify that all of the equipment has been set up.
And now, I know the plan in the primary was these troubleshooters you were going to have a lot of high school students? Is that right?
Well, we wanted to recruit high school and college students to do this work because it's about as complicated as setting up a PS4, and as you know, I don't know if you play Fortnite.
I don't know.
It's not hard to set those up. So we wanted to get folks that because really the question was, are folks going to be intimidated by this, right? And what we came to realize was no. In fact, we had a couple of instances, I think, as we discussed, where on-site troubleshooters that did not have the training were talked through setting up in August on the phone. So this isn't really as complicated as we thought it was going to be. And I think one of the mistakes we made was kind of underselling or underthinking what our folks out in the field were able to do. They are able to do this, and through all of the interactions we've had so far, folks are excited about doing it because they can. It's not really that hard. We've also improved the training, and we've actually made some improvements on the equipment itself, adding labels, adding much more easily followed instructions on all of the electronic equipment that's getting set up. So this is going to have a very different look than August did.
Okay, just, Mr. Chair, just a little bit about training. So if you can specifically talk about what training has been done at this point, up to this point in time, for the workers who will be working on Election Day.
Right. So we've already had a handful of trainings specifically for our troubleshooters and our inspectors. The vast majority of our training is going to be taking place over the next couple of weeks. I want to thank our superintendent, Steve Watson, for letting us use his facilities. Since we've got so much stuff going on at the warehouse, we just didn't have the space. So we're going to actually do a lot of training up at McKeesa's headquarters on Indian School and Central. So another bit of cooperation from the rest of the county there. The bulk of our training is actually going to be happening over the next several weeks. We're a couple of weeks out. That's really when you want to concentrate those training appointments, get folks in so that they can have the freshest eyes on that and moving forward. As to the specifics within the training, I think that we have really addressed a lot of the issues that had come up. We've changed a couple of things. For example, the out-of-precinct votes. That was one of the points of consternation with a lot of folks that were worried that their votes wouldn't count. Provisional balloting was we wanted to make sure to clarify that an out-of-precinct ballot at a vote center is a valid ballot and will be counted. So we've improved a lot of those very particulars, not only in the training itself, but we've augmented some of the basics. We've added some security briefings and things of this nature. We're working with a lot more closely with our federal, state, and local law enforcement folks to make sure that we address the concerns about crime, anti-terrorism, and voter suppression. Since we are critical infrastructure, we felt it necessary. And as an aside to that, I just want to let you all know, and I'll describe more if you want to go into a different setting, we will have some folks embedded in our operation to make sure that we've got as tight a grip on our security circumstances as we possibly can and be able to respond as quickly as we can if we've got issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fontes. That's all I have right now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Gallardo, I'm going to turn it to you if you have any questions at this time. Okay, thank you, Steve. Mr. Hickman.
I think most of my questions are going to be probably after the audit teams give their report a little bit. I do try to be a windshield guy and not a rearview mirror guy, as I say quite often. But I will ask a question in the rearview mirror side real quick, because it could lead to some changes that you guys are making on this next one. Dr. Bob Branch was here in September, and he gave his comments, and he couldn't be here today because of a family medical emergency. But I wanted to ask something for him just real quickly. He asked if I could ask for him about the live ballot issues. He talked a little bit about that when he addressed our board, so I thought it would be good to talk about it right now. He put, during the September 5th meeting, Dr. Branch claimed that the county recorder's office transported thousands of live ballots on the night of the primary in an unsecure manner. Chairman Shukri called on Mr. Fontes to speak to Dr. Branch's claims. Mr. Fontes admitted that live ballots were in fact transported in an unsecure manner the night of the primary election. Here's his questions. Number one, how many ballots were transported in an unsecure manner the night of the primary election? Do you guys know that yet?
I don't have that answer off the top of my head, but we can look into it.
We haven't found that out yet?
I don't have that number for you today.
Okay. So you might not be able to answer any of these, but I'll just ask them real quick. What was done with those live ballots? Were they counted or discarded? Do you know that?
So if we had live ballots that came back, we certainly would have handled them just like we would any other live ballots. We would have run them through our tabulators. If they were outstacked, we would have processed them by hand. And if they were, in fact, valid and counted, then they would have been valid and counted. So there's no discriminating between these ballots and those ballots. But this does bring up a very, very important point. And one of the reasons why we're so excited about the fact that we are moving towards the models that we are moving towards. Every pre-printed ballot in Maricopa County is a point of security vulnerability. Every single one. We pre-print hundreds of thousands of ballots that never even come out of their packaging. And so, in fact, for 2016 and 2018 through all the cycles, we'll have about $724,000 of pre-printed ballots that never even get unpackaged. And that's because we still have a model where pre-printed ballots and polling place tabulators exist. What Dr. Branch is speaking to, in my mind, is a much bigger policy question, and that is this. Where our vote centers issue not pre-printed ballots, but printed on-site ballots, we have a receipt and auditing record that is second to none in that we know which ballots were requested, when they were requested, and if they get put into those envelopes, then we can track them all the way through the system up to the point where they're in the warehouse and separated from the envelope. That's an accounting that does not exist when you have pre-printed ballots and polling place tabulators. And so we can have a high level of confidence because 85% of our vote comes through in these envelopes with the voter's signature on them. But again, I go back to the point where you have pre-printed ballots, every single one is a potential point of vulnerability. And where security is one of the pillars of our operation, we certainly prefer and hope that we'll be able to move to a vote center model the way Yavapai County and Yuma County have for years and years and years, where every ballot is placed into an envelope, the voter signs that envelope, and it goes through the same level of scrutiny that any other vote-by-mail voter sees. And then we have real accountability in real time for every single ballot that gets processed in the system. So Dr. Branch has got a really, really great point there that speaks to a really big policy question. Under the model that was approved for this year, we have the hybrid with 40 vote centers where those types of ballots in the envelopes will be printed individually. Anyone out of any precinct can vote at any of those 40 sites. But we still have a circumstance where pre-printed ballots and on-site tabulation is available. And frankly, as I've stated 100 times before, I still think that's a lesser level of security. And those kinds of concerns have happened in the past, and they happened in August, and I'd like to eliminate them altogether.
Do you know how many, I don't think I heard this, do you know how many live ballots were actually cast and what was the accounting on that? Were they cast?
Well, here's the difficulty, Mr. Chair, Supervisor Hickman. I don't know what Dr. Branch's definition of live ballot is.
Okay.
And let me give you a reason why. If you have ballots that are ostensibly counted by the tabulators at a polling place, and something happens to the data pack on the back of that tabulator between where it leaves the polling place and with the ballots is transported back to Central, we can still use those ballots in a regular tabulator at Central and tabulate those ballots. Is he considering those ballots live?
He's not here to ask a question.
So,
I just wanted
again,
to,
I don't want to
Okay.
be inaccurate or unresponsive.
I think his problem was, and a lot of our problem is just the way they were transported and being unsecured and then figuring out what occurred, what happened. and we need a better accounting of that, I believe. So,
Absolutely, and I think we already have a really phenomenal method that's been used in Maricopa County for years and years, and it's been exclusively used in other counties for a long time as well, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to move to that model.
okay, so I'm hoping my colleagues will ask about, the training you're talking about. I'm very happy that there's been county workers that are standing up and putting their hands up and saying, I want to help on election day. I think our board reached out to the county as well. Joy definitely has in a good way. It's kind of considered as jury duty also around here. They're being paid for it. My question is, they also currently have jobs, and you're saying we're going to be reaching out about this training. They currently have jobs. They haven't been reached out. A vast portion of them haven't been reached out to yet to tell them where to check in, what's the training going to be involved, how long is it going to be involved. I think we need to get a better idea because the clock is ticking. It's really hard for probably any of us to say, hey, we're going to be telling you guys to have a specific job in a day, but we'll let you know when that training is, and we'll at a certain date. But you got to check in on November 6th to do the job well. So I hope we get a little bit more clear and have enough time to tell these employees that. I know you're working on it. Last thing I'm going to ask is, you mentioned just now that looking at the primary, you assert a breach of contract by an outside contractor.
Yes.
Just said it. I have not heard if you are going to, maybe I missed it, but are you also going to be employing, or are you looking to employ another contractor to do those same types of services, or are you expecting the new volunteers or the county that have IT experience to be able to do that? I just haven't heard if you've hired anyone else on a component that was a major breakdown on the primary.
Right. Well, just to very briefly elaborate on that, we were made a certain guarantee of a certain amount of manpower that was going to be available on a day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. That did not happen. It did not happen on that day, and it didn't happen the following day early in the morning on Tuesday, as was guaranteed orally to me personally. And so we're not using any contractor. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing the same thing we've done for a long time. We're going to be training folks to utilize and set up the equipment, and as will probably be indicated, our site book equipment is actually easier to set up than the precinct-based tabulators that we've been using for decades. So I want to make sure that you understand that when you talk about new volunteers coming in, these are folks who work for the county, they work with equipment, they do stuff. A lot of our inspectors who are going to be on site doing this setup are folks who have, again, already had experience with this equipment just a month and a half ago. So it's not like we're bringing fresh folks off the street to set things up.
Okay.
Plus, the training is really thorough. And again, we've had a couple of trainings already, I think 2 or 3 training sessions as we've moved forward, and our feedback is really great. People are very confident that they can do the job, they can do it within the time allotted.
I'm just verifying that. You are not considering hiring an outside specialist for this coming general election to help where the other contractor, in your words, have failed. That's going to be reliant on current poll workers or county staff or county elections department, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think, Mr. Hickman, what you're circling around, and I think, Mr. Fontes, you're aware of, is that the workers, some of the workers that were participating in the election on primary day did not feel as though they were properly trained and that there was a bit of chaos. And so what I think we're trying to pinpoint is the training component is very critical, as you now understand and are aware, and that how people are trained, what they're trained specifically to do is carried out. So I think that's what Mr. Hickman is getting to, and that's just the punctuation point, if you will, of what we're
And
trying
I
to say
think
this morning.
it bears repeating, Mr. Chairman, had our contractor performed in the first place as they had promised, had they actually met their contractual obligations, those other smaller issues would have been dealt with like every other election day's issues get dealt with. I mean, Mr. Gallardo will tell you all, and I'm sure you've heard it 100 times, every election has problems. Every election has circumstances. We had one precinct, for example, where the inspector and the judge did a thorough inventory of all the ballots they had on hand, and come election day morning, those very same people reported back to us that they didn't have certain ballots. Mistakes get made. This is a human system. And had it not been for the compounding impact of this non-performance and the fact that it turned a huge portion of our polling places into utter chaos, we would have been able to alleviate all of these other minor concerns relatively quickly. Moreover, I think that we solved the problems very quickly. Let's not forget, of the 62 polling places that had difficulties on November 28th, my staff opened 22 of them. Not the contractor, who said they were going to have 70-plus staff available at the first thing in the morning. So if we want to look at why some of these other minor issues became big issues, why they were amplified, I think we need to be very focused on who was responsible for what. We certainly had minor gaps in training. There's no question about that. We have a new system that thousands of people are going to be using all over the county. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure to deploy it as much as we did. Mostly in Mr. Hickman's district, but also Mr. Gates and Gallardo's district, we had a disproportionately fewer number of problems in what is CD8, because those folks had already had a chance to use the system. And so we know that that familiarity helps. This November, we're going to have folks who are our people setting up with better training, and we're going to be able to monitor those things live with our augmented technology. So we'll have eyes on every single one of these units at every single polling place with our new monitoring technology. And again, in another setting, I'll be very happy to brief you on how that looks, and I think that will alleviate some of the concerns that you have.
Thank you. Mr. Barney, and before I ask you to begin, I do want to have just a housekeeping issue. We have made accommodations. We're clearly going to go beyond 11 o'clock, and so we have made accommodations to push forward. So, Mr. Barney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we probably need to hear from Mr. McGee on the internal audit side and Mr. Brown on the external audit and his team. This isn't a finger-pointing exercise here. This is what are we going to do 15 days from now to succeed. Right now, 2 weeks from now, people are setting up polling places, around 600 of them. So we've got a lot of work to do. In my mind, I don't want to talk about ballot on demand, the process. That's not going to change between now and 15 days from now. My concern is simply this, and we've heard it, so I'm sorry to retread the tire. To Mr. Fontes's point, this is a human system. At the heart of this, we've got a lot of great people that volunteer and serve, and so I don't want this to come across as negative to them. We need them. We need more of them. We need them back. We need them smiling and happy and engaged and focused. Where we let them down, and I'm worried about it still, is what are we doing on training? I mean, I hear that a few weeks from now we'll do that. Well, that's 15 days. It's boots on the ground. So there's no comment necessary. So I'm concerned about training. I'm concerned about clarified processes and procedures. And mostly I'm concerned about communication, both leading up to the election and contingency planning for day of election. When you have, Mr. Fontes talks about onboarding 4,000 people, that's a massive exercise. It's complicated in any space when you have a lot of time. Well, we haven't effectively onboarded them if they haven't been trained. And yet we're going to send them out not to one location but to hundreds and hope that we figure it out. So I'm worried about our communications plan, the clarified processes and procedures. And so I think we probably need to hear from our consultants, hear some of their observations, and then we'll know the question to ask. And more importantly, I think we need very, very specific and detailed guidelines on what's the training plan look like, what are the clarified processes and procedures, and what's our communications plan both leading up to the election day, so say through Sunday, what's the communications plan for setup the day before on Monday, and really it's going to be different as it relates to what happens on election day when we do have problems. I think that we all recognize that as a team, that there's going to be problems, there's going to be circumstances that we can't control. That being said, I think where we need to be more cogent is what does that communications plan and those clarified process procedures look like? So that's my comments, and I'm anxious to
Very
hear
well
from
stated,
the
Mr. Barney.
audience.
One question, Mr. Gardo, please, go ahead.
Some focus on training for this go-around. So I guess, Adrian, if you can kind of share with us who's doing the training, how often are the training provided, how long is the training, that sort of stuff. I think that's important for us to know as well. If I remember back in this is some time ago, and elections were ran much differently then. Technology was different as well. But there was like ongoing training, like if I remember right, it was every weekend you had training. You had them, two times a week too. You had training, and we would invite probably around 50 or so board workers at a time to come in and do training. It was a requirement. I mean, if you wanted to work, you had to go through a training. If you didn't get an opportunity to go through training, you couldn't participate. So could you share like who's doing the training is one big question. How often are we doing the training, and when are these trainings being taken place?
Great question. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Supervisor, I present to you our project manager, Christy Passarelli. I believe you've met her once or twice, Steve.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Let me give you some background on what we're doing to revamp training. So I'm glad you remembered your numbers of 50. There are 50 people assigned to each of the training classes. We actually started our trainings on Thursday. So today is day one, actually, of the outside the office training. We have 2 teams set out at least twice a day, from every day until we're finished getting all of the board workers trained. Every inspector and every backup inspector or first judge is required to attend the in-person training. In Mr. Fontez's speech, he mentioned that we are having every board worker take the online training. We did redevelop the online training to encompass all general aspects of election day processes. The in-person trainings are at least 3 hours, at least that's what the 2 test days we're running, and they are hands-on, setting up equipment, setting up an edge, programming a card for a voter, looking at what the Insight tabulator does, how does it work, where it needs to go, hands-on. So in different groups, we have 6 people at each training, a trainer, 4 assistant trainers, and a coordinator. So they are physically touching and doing the job that they're going to do on the Monday setup. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions.
No, and it is a requirement, correct, in order to participate?
It is a requirement. The moment that they are reconfirmed as being hired, the inspector and the judge have to attend the in-person training. And we are getting the records of everyone that takes the online training class, so they are being told that it's mandatory.
And if we could you comment very briefly on just the opening process, not just for setup on Monday, but more focused on from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. on Election Day, because I think that's where the real concern is, to make sure that we are operational, doors open at 6 a.m.
Okay, so we have moved our start time for the boards to get to the facilities to be open at 5. So that's giving an extra 30 minutes. Once they go through their opening procedures, they are to contact the troubleshooter and our hotline to let us know that their location is open. So as these calls are coming in to our hotline, which we have also expanded, we will know who is not set up so that we can dispatch a troubleshooter immediately to that particular location if they're having difficulties. So instead of rushing to have things done in 30 minutes, we're giving, hopefully the first 30 minutes is the setup and the second 30 minutes is the calm before the doors open. My goal is that we will not have any significant issues on Election Day with all of the people who are going to be assisting in that process.
Ms. Passarelli, forgive me if you've already commented on this. You spoke about the online. Is there no hard copy training manuals at all?
There are hard copy
Okay.
training manuals, so it's in addition to
Okay.
that. So every inspector and judge will have their hard copy election
keep-
day
to
manuals.
keep, to make sure they can-
Correct, and we will also supplement one for every inspector's packet that we send to the election sites.
Perfect.
Additionally, I would, particularly to alleviate these concerns, because I think they're real, and I have no grief or consternation with the examination, I would encourage you or your staff to come down and attend one of the trainings so that you could see the thoroughness and, really reap the rewards of actually being there and learning about the particulars that our election day folks are actually going to be experiencing. I think that would really help, and so we'll invite, and if you want to coordinate through Ms. Passarelli's office, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Gardo, are there any more questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Adrian, I know the previous discussion we had there at the board in the auditorium, I think it was during the canvass of the primary, there was a small discussion on the troubleshooters, and I think there was in some cases some troubleshooters had like 8 or 9 precincts that they were assigned to. I thought that was kind of high for one troubleshooter to kind of be managing 9. Did we reduce that number? Were we able to increase the number of troubleshooters? If those are, that's our first line of defense. So come on election day when the polls do open, if the inspector has a problem or the inspector, for whatever reason, forgets everything he's learned in his training, it's that troubleshooter that should be darting as fast as they can to that polling place to set them up and get them going. Were we able to increase the number of troubleshooters?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Supervisor, we have a hiring goal of 125. I think we've got 90.
95.
We've got 95 right now. That'll reduce the maximum number of polling locations per troubleshooter down to 4. And so your concern is a good one, and we certainly are augmenting not only the decrease in the number of polling places, but as we indicated, we're really increasing the number of hubs for supplies and equipment all over Maricopa County. So we'll have even higher levels of T-Techs and our permanent staff located all over Maricopa County to be dispatched as needed and as necessary through the course of the day. So at the end of the day, all things can, God willing and the creek don't rise, it'll be overkill in that area.
Is there, Adrian, and I know, going back to like the hotline room, and I know you guys still utilize a hotline room type method, which is, I think it's good. How do you communicate currently with the troubleshooters now? Is it through phone? Is that you utilize your cell phone to call in?
It's Christy again. So the troubleshooter hotline has 15 phones that are differentiated between election day workers to call in and the troubleshooters, and we can increase or decrease as needed. And we still have our radio program. I know Steve's probably familiar with that I used to be the dispatcher for all of the troubleshooters at one time. So we do have the two-way walkie-talkies split into 2 different groups by variation of the county. So the West Valley is odd numbers and the East Valley is even numbers. We'll have 2 radio dispatchers that will share that responsibility of contacting them directly.
And again, I would absolutely love to have the opportunity to chat with you all about some of the enhanced security measures that really speak to this idea of communication, live monitoring of the polling sites, and so forth. I think that would definitely alleviate some of these concerns, which are certainly legitimate.
So going back, just so I have in my mind, Christy, so you have 15 lines in the war room, I guess you could call it, the troubleshooter room. How many of those 15 are designated strictly for the inspector? And I'm assuming the inspectors have their own line to call in should there be a problem or if they have a question. And how many of those out of the 15, how many are designated for troubleshooters, I guess?
We're going to start off with 10 and 5, so 10 for election day, 5 for the troubleshooters, but that's a variance of how the calls are going to come in. So between 5 and 5:45, all of those lines are going to be for the inspectors to call in and report that they're set up. At 5:45, I'll take the 5 troubleshooter lines and turn those on specifically for troubleshooters to call in, because they have a secondary way to reach us, and that's through the radio. So if we can man up the initial phone lines for just our inspectors, and then we'll go back to the one-on-one phone contact if we need it, but they always have their radio as their first point of reaching us.
Now, so I mean, I like to try to think outside the box, like what type, and it's impossible to try to figure out every type of scenario. But here is one that I did get a couple of emails on, and that was that some of the polling places did not have any provisional envelopes. So if that's the case, if, let's say, for whatever instance, it's human error again, it's no one's fault, just human error. If a polling place finds out Election Day morning there's no provisional envelopes, what happens then? The inspector calls you all. Does the troubleshooter have extra provisional envelopes in their vehicle or on their persons to be able to supplement what they may need, or how does that work, I guess?
Yes, there was an issue with envelopes being dispersed. We found that out early on, and if the troubleshooter didn't make it there with their envelopes in the primary, they didn't have backup in the primary, but they do have backup envelopes in their supply kits this time.
Perfect. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gallardo. Mr. Fontes, one question I have for you. You spoke about it earlier in your comments in talking about how you're monitoring each and every polling place and trying to keep our lines as smooth as possible and not from getting too long. Why wouldn't you automatically dispatch more poll workers or some kind of symmetry if you see those lines starting to get long versus calling them? Because my immediate thought would be if you call them, they're already overwhelmed. That was part of, I think Mr. Gallardo alluded to it as well, that was part of the problem. People were overwhelmed on primary day, and that included troubleshooters, that included our hotlines and everything else. So why wouldn't we just automatically dispatch? And I'm not sure if this was an idea from the auditing team or not to have this monitored on a per precinct basis. But why wouldn't we do that? Why would we call when it seems like they would be overwhelmed?
Well, again, my presentation really was a big overview, and we will be dispatching folks, but also if we dispatch and call and the call results in, oh yeah, we're just kind of chit-chatting, we forgot to run the lanyard, there's no reason to have someone called out and rushing out there. We want to communicate with our folks on the ground because they're the ones that know exactly what's going on. So without getting into every detail of every process, the presentation certainly would leave some of these extra details open, and I think that it's correct for you to wonder that. The fact that we have this capacity now is the important point. The fact that we can see which polling places don't have lines. You know, if we've got a master board with 500 and however many polling places on it, and everything is checked in 15 minutes after the hour, we're good. And national studies will tell us that 20 minutes is actually an expectation of voters surveyed around the United States. So when we're looking at a 20-minute, 30-minute sort of flag going up, we're well within margins of what some voters, the majority of voters around the United States will expect when they decide to go vote in person. So the fact that we can actually monitor this is a really wonderful innovation, and we will be reacting in a way that's not only similar to the way that you're suggesting, but the way that we also stated. I just didn't want to really get too much into the details of every aspect.
And I think we'll all agree, and this isn't a criticism, it's the details is what's going to make or break us on November 6th. And so with that, we thank you. I think we'll stop questions for now. Mr. McGee has been patiently sitting there at the edge of his seat at one moment, then you figured out we were going to go long. So Mike, why don't you come up? This is Mr. Mike McGee. He is our Maricopa County Auditor. And we also have our external auditor with Barry Dunn, I believe, who you're going to introduce, and we're happy to have both of you here today and appreciate your work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members of the board. In light of issues surrounding the primary election, Chairman Chukri called for an internal review and an external review by an independent firm to look at the processes for election day readiness and contingency planning. The internal review was performed by the Internal Audit Department. At least we performed an expedited review within the first couple of weeks. We issued an interim report on that, which we, to this day, stand by those recommendations and stand by that report. For the external review, we solicited proposals from 10 qualified firms on September 10th and awarded the contract to Barry Dunn on September 19th. Barry Dunn was selected because they have a well-established reputation and consulting expertise in elections and project management. Barry Dunn serves clients in all 50 states, working with over 300 government entities. I'm pleased that Bill Brown, the principal in charge of this project, is here representing Barry Dunn. I would like to ask Bill to take the remainder of this agenda item to introduce his team and provide the status of their work and share some current recommendations for the upcoming general election. Mr. Brown, the time is yours.
Mr. Brown, thank you for being here and working with us. We're relying heavily on you and Mr. McGee, as well as the Elections Department, to ensure that November 6th is a success, and we understand you've got the credentials to do so, as just outlined, and obviously from the materials we've been presented with prior to this meeting. So welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Supervisors. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. We appreciate this opportunity to briefly introduce Barry Dunn to you, describe the scope of our project, and summarize our preliminary observations and recommendations. Particular thanks to Internal Audit for all the support and collaboration in this effort, and to the Recorder's Office for the spirit of cooperation and the responses to our requests for interviews and meetings in an extremely, obviously, tense and time-constrained period leading up to the general election. Barry Dunn is a CPA and consulting firm founded in 1974. We have 375 employees across 6 offices and located remotely, and obviously our Phoenix office right here in town in the capital and the county seat of Maricopa County. Our firm provides assurance, tax, and consulting services. Our client base has included over 300 governments, which include cities, towns, counties, consolidated city counties, independent cities, as well as state and other quasi-governmental entities. I'm a principal in our government consulting group. I lead a practice area referred to as government assurance. The services that we offer from my practice area personally are cybersecurity, risk management and compliance, and financial management services. And we work primarily with state, local governments. Our project team for this project was very small, actually, in recognition of the fact that the footprint at the Recorder's Office needed to be small with so much going on. So we had 6 individuals. A couple of them are who are here today, but we'll zip right through this. Yoko McCarthy is our project manager. She leads our compliance and risk management practice. She was formerly with Office of the State Auditor for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and holds a number of credentials, including Certified Government Financial Manager, the CISA, and the CFE. Mike Martell is our elections subject matter expert and our project management subject matter expert. Mike's extensive experience included work with Miami-Dade County to review their election planning and their election day processes. And the nature of that work was to assist them with mapping processes and creating project management tools that help to facilitate successful election planning as well as actual day activities. And Mike holds a number of versions of the project management professional, which I can't remember, but he's taught it academically as well as in a professional setting for training. Megan O'Brien is right here in our Phoenix office, and Megan has had experience prior to her life with Barry Dunn working with and for the county and the Arizona Auditor General and City of Phoenix, and she is currently engaged working with our local government group, including some of the municipalities in Maricopa County. Rick Amage, co-lead of our cybersecurity practice with background in the Coast Guard, which led to his designation as a fully qualified Navy validator. Also gained a lot of experience in deploying complex IT solutions in the military setting, and that came to bear with some of the work involved here. And lastly, Caroline Gay was our project coordinator, experience with local government entities, organizing information, and just ensuring the efficient and effective communication for particularly time-sensitive projects. I'm a CPA, and I've been with Barry Dunn for over 30 years. My background is auditing, consulting in the private and public sector, including fraud investigation, forensic accounting, and expert witness testimony. It's all about Barry Dunn. Our scope for this project, in a very summarized fashion, was three-part. The first part was to follow up on the recommendations for planning for the general election that were made by internal audit based on their review of the primary election processes and documented in the interim report. Not an audit, it's an assessment, it's a consulting project, but it's very much of an assessment type follow-up on recommendations that had been made, issues that had already been identified. Number two was to identify any additional areas for improvement in planning and election day activities based on our own observations. Number three was to provide recommendations for further follow-up on those and effective implementation of those recommendations that were made by internal audit, as well as the areas of potential improvement that we identified and have been communicating in an informal basis during this brief engagement. And, you know, it probably all goes without saying, but the nature and time constraints of this particular project didn't allow for a nice, neat, you know, have a signed, sealed, and printed deliverable every 3 or 4 weeks. This is kind of a real-time collaborative process, you know, with the goal of actually making some improvements to the election process, not just presenting you with a report that you can have collect dust on the shelf. And I guess while I'm on that topic, just be aware that our final report will include all of these comments and observations, which are not news to anybody in internal audit or the recorder's office, but they will also include some other longer-term recommendations that we're going to make that wouldn't be appropriate to spend time on today, but we've had feedback that those are welcome, and so those will appear in the final version of this report, along with some updates to what you hear today. In other words, you may hear something today that will be addressed by the time we issue our final report. I'll talk about that in a minute. So our approach has included a review of the work product developed by and the information gathered by internal audit, interviews of the recorder's office staff and attendance at meetings, internal discussions, and other types of communications with them. And then thirdly, we've requested, obtained, and reviewed additional documents directly from the recorder's office supporting the progress on recommendations and the status of the issues related to those recommendations. Very quick timeline of this project for your reference. As Mike mentioned, we were engaged on September 19th. We started our on-site procedures with our kickoff on September 25th. A draft of our report will be delivered this Friday, October 26th. I hope I'm getting my dates right. And the final report will be delivered on November 2nd. As I mentioned, the extremely compressed timeline for this project has required us to provide our informal recommendations and our suggestions to the recorder's office as we identify these areas for improvement. Nothing new here today to the people who are involved in this work. And again, just to reiterate, over the next couple of days, we'll be wrapping up our draft report, and during that time, we will be incorporating all the information that we have as quickly as we can. But do realize that there is a cutoff for reports, and in order to wrap the thing up, we are going to need to stop incorporating those, but that doesn't mean that there is no improvement being made simply because the report has been issued. And it's just a fair sort of alert for you. So our observations and our recommendations could be grouped in any number of ways, but we chose to categorize them according to 3 particular groupings that I'm sure you're all familiar with. One is staffing, recruiting, and training. Another one is technology management, and the third one is project management. And I realize that you may be wondering why we don't have a particular bucket for some other things, but for instance, contingency planning is a theme that cuts across all of these, and it's really a part and parcel of those 3 buckets. And I think we get there, and the buckets that they're in are not tremendously important. I would like to say that our most significant general observation, and we all know how dangerous it is to generalize, but you got to do that if you don't want to be around all day talking about this in detail, is that we observed through our interviews and our meetings with the Recorder's Office a huge effort to correct problems that were identified during the primary elections. Very significant effort, a lot of attention paid to the areas for improvement and the risk areas that have been noted. A lot of committed, good people working at that project, and a lot of things that just make a lot of sense in terms of the responses that we've seen. The largest gap that we see, again in general, and I'm going to walk through these more specifically, has to do with the areas of documentation, in some cases communication and structure, all things that are difficult to do in a compressed time frame when you're juggling some very serious priorities with a lot at stake, and we understand that. Many of the longer-term suggestions and recommendations that you'll see in the final report do relate to further expansion of the formalization of good, solid project management and, communication with a lot of transparency to it. Those are not what I'm talking about today. The ones that we're talking about here are ones that we hope can be implemented in the short term prior to the election. And basically, when it comes to the structure and these more formal methodologies, it's how we feel is that good processes and good committed people can just be managed with more predictability and consistency when you're practicing some of those disciplines. So given limited time, I'm going to focus on the issues and then the progress without rereading to you internal audit's recommendations. And although I may not specifically call it out, there are recommendations that we have already made that has already been progress on, and just to give recognition of the fact that, again, this is another layer at which some things have already been done, and I'm probably not going to mention them all because an assessment is critical by nature, and we've got a lot to do. So I'm going to walk through these by area, and I'll try to make this quick and relatively painless. Obviously, huge issue that's drawn all kinds of attention, a lot of concern, a lot of heartburn is there sufficient staffing for Election Day activities? And just some of the things that we noted, and you will have already heard some of this from Recorder Fontes, a lot of it probably, and I apologize for the redundancy, but I feel it's my job to support that and let you know what we did see, is that it does appear that they have identified and recruited resources needed to provide support in each different type of role. Those activities are clearly going on. You heard about that. And it does look to us like the math works out that the dedicated setup staff on a per-site basis has increased. So there is simply more resources dedicated to individual sites. As you know, the Insight staff have been backfilled with a new role, that of IT troubleshooter. And there is a master staffing spreadsheet that is going to be created on October 26th, and we're not quite clear on if that's going to be all staffing or just the setup. And we received actually another document on Friday that we need to look at, but effectively the one that we are looking for, I think, is going to be done on the 26th. So our recommendation is to ensure that that staffing spreadsheet includes all the staff for the general election across the enterprise and be updated as soon as possible, with the benefits, obviously, of providing transparency into that process and just a real good way to manage that and make sure that the gaps have, in fact, been identified, just because we feel that in sort of the individual silos of hiring, which are extremely important, it can be easy to lose sight of that, those magic numbers that constitute the gaps. And, what do you need on a daily basis? Second area of concern is there adequate role-specific training for election workers? And some of the updates and progress that you've already heard, but maybe not all of them, are that the board workers and troubleshooters are required to complete online training, which includes site book setup training. Inspectors and judges are required to take an additional 3-hour in-person training, including the site book setup training. The Election Day manual is available online now, In-person training sessions, they've been planned and initiated, as the recorder mentioned, and we did participate in those and had a good experience with the sitebook technical part of that training, by the way. And additional in-person training sessions have been planned that include additional hands-on training, more of the sitebook. Anyways, our recommendation here really is pretty specific, and that is that we'd like to see the contingency plan procedures, specifically for the troubleshooters and the hotline workers, added into that mix with the training. We think that'd be a valuable addition to that. And whether or not that's been done as of 11:15 Mountain Standard Time, I don't know, but that was a recommendation that we have. The ability to monitor Election Day activity, of course, has been a focus. And Recorder Fontes talked about the dashboard, and I think he used that term, but really that's the software, that's the system that's used, the interface and the functionality that allows remote monitoring of the sitebook activity at the polling places. That dashboard, as you know, is in process, and there have been, with regard to that development process, significant efforts to make sure that the communication between the operational project team and the developer make sure that those metrics and the threshold notifications are clearly defined, and there's been much progress on that since we've been working on this, we believe. So our recommendation here is make sure to clarify staff's roles in monitoring and the procedures for responding to those alerts when they do happen. And then we also suggest using the dashboard functionality to ensure that the setup and closeout has been executed properly. The reliability of the hardware, sitebook hardware, the software, the wireless network connectivity to support voter sign-in and verification has been a concern. And the things that we've noticed is that the mobile Wi-Fi connectivity has been tested at the 21 sites that had the connectivity issues at the primary election. The board workers have now been trained to contact the troubleshooter when the connectivity issue arises, very important. Of course, the role of IT troubleshooter was added, and again, the dashboard is in progress, and the dashboard will be a key tool in monitoring that, naturally. Our recommendation would be that to ensure that any location, any polling location that is in a physically different location than it was at the primary election is included in that testing to get that coverage of the testing a bit more thorough, just to make sure that one is not going to be an issue. This next one really cuts across the different areas. This is the contingency plan concerns, and it's really around documentation and communication of those contingency plans, because these are things that from our interactions with the recorder's office have been discussed and plans made, and the ideas all sound really good and practical, but the documentation seems to be a little thin, and sometimes maybe the communication around that, or related to that, rather. But significant progress. There's between 250 and 300 spare site books that are available. These can be used offline in a similar manner to the paper roster to sign in voters so that they can continue to vote in the event of an equipment or a connectivity failure. And as Recorder Fontes mentioned, the language has been clarified so that voters can easily tell the difference between provisional voting and out-of-precinct voting, and allay some fears there that might be driving people away. And they have, in fact, prepared a handout that identifies the location of the 40 vote centers. Our recommendation here is to ensure that the board workers are trained at, pretty much the ground level on how to direct voters when on-site voting equipment is not operational. We think that that's a training that doesn't necessarily want to be left to the higher levels of those positions. We make sure that everybody can respond there, and make sure that the people who are responsible for swapping out the equipment have been clearly identified, and that there's a process in place to make sure that they understand how to keep election activity running while that mechanical swap out occurs. Project management. So the Recorder's Office did identify an individual very experienced in election activities as project manager. We heard from her. And there is a spreadsheet that is being used to track tasks by category. There are weekly meetings of the project manager, the chief deputy, and other management level staff to discuss the progress towards those tasks, which is a very good thing. And the operational staff and the technical staff are in communication to ensure that the technical staff have that situational awareness so that they can step in if there are problems that can't be addressed by the troubleshooters or the IT troubleshooters. So our recommendations here, and as I mentioned, this is an area where there's a lot to be said and a lot of room for improvement, and some of that will unfortunately have to be long-term, will benefit future elections, but may not be fully implementable in just a few weeks. So these recommendations are the ones we think could be helpful right now, and we do think that conducting structured tabletop exercises with all the elections project members to go through the what-if scenarios would be very valuable and play out those actions. We know that those conversations are happening, but it's not being done in a structured way according to the way that you typically walk through that process. And even though that is unfortunately somewhat of a time-consuming process, we think that that would add a lot of confidence to the process to walk through that. And we would also recommend that all the project tasks have documentation for the due dates, the person responsible for completing the task, and importantly, the task dependencies. And we would suggest formalizing the listing of the lessons learned process now. We know some of those ideas are being discussed and probably documented, but giving some structure and some good documentation to lessons learned would be extremely important. It goes without saying, and this is the time to start doing it. Setup of polling locations. There's been a lot of contact information collected that I don't believe was before for the facilities. It's been shared with the board workers, and it includes, importantly, after-hours contacts. Our recommendation in this area was to ensure that the specific schedule is in place and communicated to organize the logistics on the day before Election Day so that the facility and the setup staff are all able to meet, access the facility, and set up all equipment. And we think, again, that adds to some things that have already been done to increase that margin for error, just increasing the time, increasing the resource, so if and when something does go wrong, there's just a little more time and breathing space to correct it. Minimization of voting line wait times. Obviously, kind of a hot-button issue here. Recorder's Office is participating in a line wait reduction study, and they do plan to use the dashboard to monitor those wait times, as Recorder Font has discussed. And there are plans to deploy this emergency kit. They'll have an extra site book and the equipment in response to wait times that are becoming unacceptable. And we think that the most important thing to consider here, on top of what's already being done, is to update and communicate a very clear written procedure that identifies what the escalating thresholds are, 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever it is, and then the exact procedures for mitigating that. So, in closing, thanks for your confidence in Very Done. Thank you for your time, which I know we ran out of, but Very Done and this team in particular really appreciates the opportunity to work on such an important project that's just so fundamental to the democratic process here in Maricopa County. And we look forward to wrapping it up and helping improve the election process in this county.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. As we all know, and I think you suggested this in your remarks, this is what we would consider a rolling audit. That means identifying issues, calling them out, and working very quickly to rectify given what is a very tight time frame. That being said, and I know that we have this spirit of cooperation, that we all are trying to collaborate. It's in the best interest of the recorder. It's in the best interest of this board and for all of Maricopa County that it is successful. A few questions I have to you would be, first and foremost, of what percentage of your recommendations or things that you have called out that are of concern have been adopted or rectified by the Recorder's Office?
My estimate would be that approximately ones that we have informally communicated so far, perhaps 50%. 50% at this point, as of Friday.
Okay. With that being said, do you foresee anything that's glaring by way of exposure or vulnerabilities to not having a successful election or outcome on November 6th if they are not addressed?
There's nothing that's jumping out to me like a nuclear catastrophe type of risk. But the thing that I would strongly recommend is getting a handle on the analysis of the staffing and being sure that there is a one place to look to see what the gaps are, if any, and to ensure that the training is in place and accomplished for each one of them.
Okay, one additional question. And I want to make sure I heard you correctly, as it relates to the Wi-Fi issues, you said that there were some 20-odd locations that had issues that we're going back to retest to make sure that they're successful.
Correct.
Why wouldn't we test all Wi-Fi issues? Again, I go back to the plane analogy of a pilot walking around a plane every single time before that plane takes off. Why wouldn't we go through every location and make sure that everything is ready and prepped for a successful day?
Yeah. Essentially, that's our recommendation. It's my understanding that so all of the previously problematic sites are tested, and then there are other sites that were effectively tested, if you will, in the primaries. They worked properly at the time of the primaries, and the gap, from our perspective, is where a site wasn't used in the primaries, and it wasn't retested because it wasn't problematic. It couldn't have been problematic because it didn't exist before. And so that at least fills in that gap. I guess arguably you could retest the ones where there were that were used in the primaries but weren't a problem. That is one layer of the contingency plan there. Another one is the backup wireless provider and additional MoFis available in other places. So that's kind of one part of the contingency plan, and I guess there's probably some judgment as to how much risk is in there versus some of the other areas that need attention. But, I mean, certainly no harm in testing Wi-Fi connectivity anywhere. I mean, that's wise, probably.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brown. I'll turn it to my Vice Chairman. Mr. Gates?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for Mr. Brown for your presentation here. Taking a lot of notes on this, and at this point, I don't have any questions for Mr. Brown, but instead would have a few for the recorder.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Gallardo?
I don't have any questions right now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gallardo. Mr. Hickman?
A quick question. Has there been, as you guys were working with the recorder's office and the spirit of cooperation, we're trying to get through this, has a written staffing plan been offered by the recorder's office? Because we're close. Has a written staffing plan been given to you guys for any type of thoughts on it or adjustments or?
I am not aware that we have received a written staffing plan, but if anybody wants to jump up and correct me. No, we have not received a documented staffing plan.
Okay. So I'll wait.
Okay. Mr. Barney is no longer with us. All right. All right.
Denny?
Well, should he come back on the dais, which I know he will, and has questions for you, Mr. Brown, we'll call you back up. Are there any other questions for Mr. Brown or Mr. McGee by my colleagues? Okay. Thank you very much. I think, Mr. Fontes, you're being requested back to the podium, and I'll start with Mr. Gates. Well, actually, Mr. Gates, if I might take a chairman's privilege here. To the 50%, there were two questions I want to follow up on Mr. Fontes, and that is, Mr. Brown had mentioned that he believes about 50% have been of the recommendations to the Elections Department have been acted upon. That's not to say more won't be, but as of this date, 50% have. Is there an inclination and a plan to adopt all 100% of their recommendations?
No, we're not going to be implementing every single one of their recommendations, and there's a whole host of reasons for each and every single one. But the vast majority of the question and answer and back and forth that we've worked with the folks at Barry Dunn, and by the way, they've been real good to work with, so we're happy to have the extra sets of eyes and ears around. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, and we'd have to go through each and every single one individually to figure exactly why. One I can give as an example, the question that Supervisor Hickman asked, is there a written staffing plan? Well, there's no document that says staffing plan with an explanation, but as has been indicated, we do have the plans and the thresholds and the markers that we have been meeting for staffing. So there might be a little something lost in translation here where We don't have one master staffing spreadsheet. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a way to track every single one of the folks that we want to hire and whether or not we have actually met those goals that we also have set forth. So the materials may not be manifesting in a way that are preferred by one or another party in this collaboration. And I think that's fair to say. I think that we have, and I'm sure that they would recognize that we've looked at staffing goals, for example, for our poll workers, and we had each of our folks who were going to be on the phones had a certain number, I think it was 12 folks a day that they were going to be solidifying through the process, right? Now that was as to the poll workers, and it may have been on a spreadsheet over here, but not in one document called Master Staffing Plan. So we have a lot of the same sorts of work that I think would be anticipated happening, but we're not labeling it the same way or talking about it the same way. Let me give you another example. 50% of the recommendations are completed or going to be acted on. Some of them can't be acted on until later. For example, one of the types of training or the things that we're going to be setting up specifically, some of these things just are in development now or are going to be completed later. So I think that it's fair to say that the statements that you heard were absolutely accurate, and we don't disagree with really any of it. It's a question of how we look at the things that are being talked about here. So I don't know that you can put a number 50% and say that that's either halfway to a win or halfway to a loss. This is a process, and a rolling process, as you have indicated, Mr. Chair, that's going to have a whole bunch of different points and thresholds and markers and keystones that we're going to be meeting as we move forward. We're confident that we're working towards a great election, but admittedly, there are a couple of things, for example, a written staffing plan that doesn't exist, and that's because that document hasn't been created, and it won't get created. It won't get created because we're busy. We're busy actually hiring and training the folks that would be in that staffing plan. So again, formalizing something into a way that at the high executive level, for example, would be something that someone else could review is far less important to us than actually getting the job done. This is about adapt, improvise, and overcome, as I learned in the Marine Corps. And we can worry about briefing and formalizing these things later. Now, to be sure, that is an important part of the execution of this type of a project at this size. But the reality is that in a lot of areas in the election department and in many other departments, and I would argue probably all over the place, we have moved forward into setting new processes and new procedures in a dynamic environment with new technology and a whole bunch of folks, 4,000 of them, that are moving into this space. We're going to find places where we can make improvements. We're going to find places where a whole world of planning would lead us, in fact, in a different direction. And that's why we have to be agile and nimble and be able to work through all these issues.
Mr. Fontes, if I might, because we are running short on time, given there's probably two reasons why you didn't adopt or don't foresee adopting 100% of what our auditors have recommended, some because of timing, as you've indicated, but also some because you have just a disagreement about. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't say a disagreement about substance, no, Mr. Chairman. I think what the county audit team and Barry Dunn have done is really help us with a different perspective. So we're not talking about different work. We're not talking about different actual action. We're just talking about a different perspective on how they think we should be looking at things and the way we, with the experience that Ray and Christy and the rest of the team have over several decades, are looking at things. So there is no disagreement as to substance. I think there's a lot of style differences here, though.
Which is fair. I'm going to call one out, though, because I heard him clearly say, I heard Mr. Brown clearly say they would recommend making sure Wi-Fi is working and tested in all polling places. Would that be one that you would agree with?
No, and here's why. We have hundreds of locations, and we don't know why a Wi-Fi might go down from day 1 to day 0. We could test every single one of our locations on Monday at 3 p.m. before Election Day, and a cell phone tower might go down or some other connectivity issue might arise. And so with the limited resources that we have and the limited amount of time that we have and the limited access we have to locations that we don't own, we knew that it was important to attack the problems that we knew were problems, adjust to those problems, and move towards great spaces there. But, to use the airplane analogy, if I test an airplane and walk around and then I let that bird sit on the tarmac for a week and a half, don't I have to look at it again? Of course I do. And so we're looking at that extra time from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. on Election Day when we do that final "are we up and running" test as the final test of where the Wi-Fi is coming forward. So I suppose we're going to have to agree to disagree on that one, Mr. Chairman.
Right, because I would say, and I would argue, and I think any pedestrian off the street would say, if an issue comes up within that hour time frame, especially given how early it is, that for any issue to be rectified within 60 minutes prior to opening, I see a potential for a repeat of what happened on primary day.
And I don't think that that's even remotely possible, since we're going to be looking at something that's entirely different. This is a totally different setup. It's a totally different set of people on the ground. It's a totally different scenario. And when you're talking about 500 and something locations, and we may have had issues at 21, and we've tested those 21, plus some of the others where we had movement. In fact, the one that we moved in your district, I believe we've already tested. To test them all again would take a lot of resources away from some of the other tasks that have to be done. And by the way, we didn't think that the testing was going to be as difficult as it actually turned out to be. What we call the MoFi divining rods, if you will, that we got, this new equipment to test the actual signal in the actual place, have to be programmed individually per site because of the different FCC codes that every single individual different carrier has in all these different places. You can't just hold up an antenna and say, do we have a signal? You have to actually look very carefully, and that takes a lot of time and energy. And so, again, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that one.
One last question, Mr. Fontes, and that alludes to or circles back with something Mr. Hickman said earlier, and forgive me if I've missed it. As far as the security of the ballots, you're confident that we won't have a repeat of that like we did in the primary with unsecured ballots leaving the polling sites?
We've actually changed the process. We've improved the process. Well, the process that was used in August for returning ballots is a process that the Elections Department has used for a very long time. And we didn't have dissimilar circumstances, as I recall, back in 2014, even 2016. So we've changed that process. And so the hubs in these individual spaces that are going to be collecting everything have a different type of process to check in all of the ballots and the equipment and so forth that are going to be out there before that gets transported back to Central. And so the equipment that we're going to be checking into those hubs is not going to leave that hub. Nothing is leaving that hub, including whatever ballots, either live or not, and we can talk about those definitions later, won't be leaving that until we've got everything that we need. And to that end, we are definitely in a much more secure circumstance that we've been in for the last couple decades.
Thank you, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Mr. Fontes, thanks for your time today. The first thing is I just want to dig in a little bit deeper on those recommendations that you're not going to follow. I just want you to answer for me specifically whether you're going to do it or not. We can kind of figure those out. So the first one is adding the contingency plan. So having something written for at the precinct, the polling places. Is there going to be something in writing that has, specifically on where the voters are supposed to go, which voting centers are supposed to go to?
That's already been done.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Or it's in process. I think we're just finishing reproduction of that, but we've already got that taken care of.
And I got a little lost in the wireless discussion here. So those polling places that are new, and by the way, what's the number of that? How many additional polling places will we have set up in November as opposed to August?
I think we have one different location, and we had 21 that had some connectivity issues. So all of those has been tested.
Okay, so there's only one additional one?
One different one.
Okay, one different one. And that one has had the wireless connectivity tested?
As I understand it, has been tested, yes.
Okay. And then with respect to the a couple other things. One, with regard to the county employees. Now, my understanding is those county employees who have volunteered that volunteered to help, have been asked to take off Monday. Have they been asked to be willing to take off Tuesday as well?
Some have and some have not. Mr. Chairman, sorry, I apologize. I'm focused on the subject matter, not so much on the protocol. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Supervisor, some of those folks are going to be working on Monday, helping with some of that technical setup and troubleshooting and stuff like that, which is great, and we do appreciate that. Some have actually been shifted over because we've had so many that they're actually going to be working the polls on Tuesday all day long, which is a great experience for folks. They'll be there more than those 13 hours, right? They got to be there at 5 and they'll end when we finally close. So there's going to be a lot of county employees who are going to be doing that. So of the 450 so odd that we've gotten, they'll be fulfilling a whole lot of different roles. So I wouldn't be able to tell you, 12 here, 15 there, 300 there right now, but they are being asked to fulfill a variety of different slots throughout the entire operation.
One of the issues, too, as we get in real time on Election Day is going to be communications with the board.
Yes.
Do you have a plan in place on how the communications is going to occur between your office and the board?
So we have a plan that speaks to different tiers of communication depending on the type of communication, and we do have that. We have yet to chat specifically with Fields Mosley, who's our county comms person, to make sure that we can lock in exactly what roles we're going to be asking you all to play to help us promote certain information, to help us talk to voters in your particular districts about availability of precincts and whether or not there's a circumstance that needs to be dealt with. So we absolutely are looking forward to locking that down and then working specifically with your offices to help you speak specifically to your folks. I know Supervisor Gates, you're real active on Twitter, and you have a lot of folks that listen to what you have to say. If we need to share information in District 3, you're a great conduit for that. So we're hoping to solidify that plan real soon. We're going to make it as easy and user-friendly as possible so that we, in partnership with you and our voting public, can have a smooth election on Election Day. That's definitely part of our considerations.
And Mr. Chair, I appreciate that. And by the way, too, we did not have a voting center in Anthem for the primary, and I appreciate that you guys have added that for the general. That's going to be extremely helpful because, as you know, New River Precinct was actually one of the last ones to come online.
Right.
So those folks had to go 20 minutes to Cave Creek. So thank you very much.
Well, Bill, you asked for it, you got it.
No, thank you. Now, I just want to drill down on the voting numbers a little bit. So we had about 110,000 who voted on Election Day in
That's
the
about right.
primary?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, as has been reported, we have had, the amount of money that's been spent on this election is unprecedented. So I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we're not going to have a lot more people voting in the general election. Do you guys have an estimate at this point of how many people are going to vote on Election Day?
We're planning for a threefold increase, which is a lot. But I think it's actually going to be a little bit less than that. But that's where our plan sits. There's hopefully we're going to be something under 300,000.
And so you're confident we can have 3 times as many people voting, but basically use the same number of polling places. You're comfortable with that?
Well, this is a great
for
opportunity.
voting in person.
Right.
Okay.
So this is a really good opportunity for me to explain something that I think the entire community of folks looking at elections gets wrong. The number of polling places doesn't equate to the amount of voter access or the capacity for our department to process voters. Okay? And I'll go back to, I'll look in the rearview mirror for a moment to March of 2016. The reduction to 60 polling places from 400 wasn't the reason why we weren't able to accommodate voters. That wasn't the reason why we had lines 4 and 5 hours long. The fact that we only had 2 check-in lines for each of those 60 polling places was the reason. You see, all those voters got to those 60 polling places. They all stood in line. The fact that we couldn't process them through quickly enough, that was the problem. And so with our new site book check-in system and the ballot on demand, which was not available, that technology was not available in 2016, let me repeat that. We're able to process more voters more quickly. And even in our smallest polling places, we've got 3 check-ins that operate at about 4 to 5 times the speed
of the old e-poll books. So by increasing the speed and by increasing the number of actual check-in lines, it's the same thing you see at, when you go shopping at Fry's or Safeway. It's a line management question. Can we process individuals quickly? That's really what happened, and that's really where we have an increased capacity. Are there going to be lines? It's entirely possible. Are there going to be long lines? I hope not, and that's one of the reasons why we're hoping that everyone will be encouraging folks to vote early. It's convenient, it's easy, it gives you a chance to have low pressure setting. They're open right now. Locations.maricopa.vote is where you can find the schedule and the addresses. And if we can get a lot of those would-be election day voters to come in and vote early, we won't be facing any of those challenges, or at least as many. But if we do have that increased turnout, which is what we expect, we're excited about being able to accommodate those folks.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Fontes, you mentioned at some point earlier, you said something about there may be additional funding requests that you're going to make of the board.
There will be.
And so I hope you can get those to us. Again, we don't want there to be an issue on Election Day because you did not have the resources that you need. I think you've heard that from this board clearly. So, as soon as you have those, I think you should let us know so that we can consider, all reasonable requests. Sure. And then another thing, too, the master staffing spreadsheet, I think that's great that that's out there. I think that that's something that we as a board ought to have the opportunity to review so that we can help, follow along with this progress and to offer our assistance. And I hope that that's something that you'll be willing to make available to the board.
Right, Mr. Chair, Mr. Gates, that's literally a matter of taking the disparate spreadsheets and smashing them into one. And I don't think that's going to be a very difficult task, and we'd be happy to share that information with you once we get that taken care of.
Thank you, Mr. Fontes.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gallardo?
No additional questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hickman.
A couple things. Number one, I'm really concerned. I mean, elections are expensive, and I think we've budgeted for some. We know that. And I think when you said the issues that we had, it was not a dollars and cents issues. You provided enough. I think that we have been and have had a record of providing enough resources, I hope, to the elections department. I'm very concerned about not hiring the temporary contractors. There are associated other things. We talked about the Wi-Fi, maybe broken screens, the software not working. That was the first I've heard that you're not even considering using temporary contractors, and we're getting so close now that I don't know how that we do that. Are you about to say something?
I am, because I misspoke. We're not hiring the cadre of folks to set up completely on Election Day, but we do have, and Christy corrected me on that, we do have a set of temporary IT folks that we are bringing on. It's a much smaller set, and they're not doing that specific job. So I think that was just a little misunderstanding on my part of your question. So we do have some folks that we are bringing on board. It's not a ton of them. Christy, how many were there? So we'll be bringing on maybe a couple dozen, less than 20, to address any of those major concerns, and they'll be able to be dispatched around the county. So, but they will not be. We won't be hiring a group of folks primarily to set up the way that we did in the August election. That's not going to happen again. So I apologize for the miscommunication there.
Okay. Well, okay. We had a problem with the number that they sent out too few, and 20 is a whole lot smaller than the amount that we.
Well,
right?
Mr. Hickman, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Hickman, that's not everything. Those are just the temporary folks from an outside agency. Mm-hmm. We still have our IT techs, we still have our troubleshooters, we still have our inspectors on site who are having training. So when we talk about these specific individual roles, I'm not looking at it from that's the only thing we've got. I've got layers and layers of folks, and as I indicated earlier, there's a high likelihood that we're going to have some folks who are hopefully sitting around on Election Day not doing a heck of a lot because we won't have enough issues for them to deal with. Okay. And that's the goal, right? So I think when we get you the specifics about how many folks are going to be deployed across the county on Election Day, I think your concerns will be very well alleviated.
Okay. Yeah. And I do want to applaud the staff on the CD8 compressed election that you worked hard for, and the recorders and the election staff worked hard for, because it did go off pretty well. There was a lot less people voting the day of, but that was what that election called for. But you reflect back and say we didn't have as many issues in CD8 because we had some people that were trained and just had an election a couple months before. And we're talking about a plane that's flying and can't fly, and we have to walk around the plane. Well, 2 of the planes didn't fly that day till 11 o'clock in that district, right? So, again, visiting them, they had some very poor morale going on because they couldn't fly at 6 in the morning. Right. So we worked on that. Anyway, I just wanted to reflect on that. I'm sure that Denny might want to have a couple things to say too, but I'm going to just say one more thing. Our internal audit team came back to our board, and it's a public document, is saying, here's what we found so far, here's our recommendations, and we look for a response. And some of them, your responses, you guys made your responses, but one of them that I found troubling is this, and I'll read it. I'm sorry, guys, I'm going to read it. Leading up to the primary election, there was not a project leader responsible for coordinating election setup activities internally between employees and externally with a contractor for outside services. Based on our preliminary review, our internal audit team, there were logistical and communication issues with a lack of accountability. Prior to our review, the Recorder's Office had recognized this issue and designated a person to serve as its project leader for the general election. Their recommendation to us was ensure that this new project leader has the resources, support, and ability to successfully plan and execute the general election activities while mitigating potential pitfalls. This includes ensuring collaborative communications and coordination of efforts between all persons involved to facilitate a successful election day. So here we are up on the general. Your office response was nothing to that. Would you like to change the response at this time? Has a month given you a new way to answer that question? Are we still not assigning responsibilities? And if so, who is that person that our board can be confident in?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Supervisor, first, I want to make sure to go back to that question about those 2 polling places in CD8. We resolved that problem by creating a redundancy in the ballot-on-demand printers. As you recall, in CD8, only 1 ballot-on-demand printer was dispatched to each of the 55 precincts. In our vote center model now, there are 2 ballot-on-demand printer pairs, which include the small envelope printer. So those circumstances that you mentioned that were lessons learned for CD8 have been alleviated. Okay. Moreover, and to answer that question, one of the things that we're looking at here is whether or not the project manager has, I guess, we're in a very, let me just put it this way, we're in a very different posture than we were before the August election. And let me, yet again, and I know I sound like a broken record here, be perfectly clear. We had very, very different expectations about the way Monday, August 27th was going to roll and the way Monday or Tuesday, August 28th was going to happen. I will continue to wait for, and I anticipate internal audit to speak very specifically to a contractor that has sent us a bill for $148,000 that is, in my humble view, in material breach of the contract. And that specific question speaks exactly to that point. We don't have that issue this time around. We don't have a relationship between an external contractor who's supposed to be setting up all of our sites and our internal operation. It's just the internal operation. So I didn't think that we needed to answer that question because that doesn't exist anymore. Now, as to the tangential part about that, how are we going to look at internally the way we end up setting up and the way we have resources allocated for our project manager? It's quite obvious that what we're working on with the suggestions of internal audit and of the external review team here, as you've already heard, are falling along the paths, and we're walking into a lot of these markers as we go forward, moving ahead. And so that accountability, That tracking is happening already. But as I understood that question, it was about the relationship between the contractor and our office, and that to me was no longer relevant, so I didn't feel like it was necessary.
So last follow-up question then, Mr. Fontes, then, and thank you guys for being here. I've been used, as I've been on this board, and we talk about elections and issues thereof, I've always been used to, up until 2 years ago, I was very much used to having our elections director also speak to us.
Sure.
Quite often, the person that you took her off, or that office, and would bring the elections director and speak to some of these issues. But this entire time, you haven't really afforded the opportunity for Mr. Valenzuela to speak about some of these things. And a lot of this stuff, I believe, is in your purview. I know the buck stops here, but you're asking for county staffers to work alongside your staff, and that head of your department really hasn't said much about it. Is that by design, or is he leading the charge? Are you the quarterback that I'm wondering is being addressed here, or are you the quarterback?
Well, the buck stops with me because I'm the one that got elected. So I feel like it's my responsibility to address you and address the voters of Maricopa County.
Okay.
I think that we've got enough of an understanding among the entire team. As you've heard, we work well enough together behind the scenes that I think it's important that you all and everybody else recognize that you've got an elected here that is digging into the details, that is directly involved in the problem solving and the planning and the execution. And when necessary, I absolutely want to make sure that our players get involved. In fact, our assistant director, Christy, got up and where she had specific information, had it to offer. So I don't want anybody to think that Mr. Valenzuela either doesn't have my faith or my complete backing. He does. And so I think that that's just the posture that I've chosen to take. And if you want to hear from Mr. Valenzuela, you're more than free to ask him any questions. I mean, he is the county election director, but thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hickman. Mr. Barney.
Well, we're right on schedule. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, my concerns are still the same. It's training, it's communications, it's these clarified procedures, and there's no comment necessary. You've made your point. You're a great communicator. You're passionate. I love your personality. Think the world of Ray and Christy, but you're asking us to trust you, and at the same time you're saying we're too busy to give you anything in detail. And I know you're doing it. I know you're working on it, and the devil's in the details. And in 15 days, we're either going to look back and say we nailed it, or we didn't. And you brought up the presidential preference election in 2016. You're the only new face in the three that wasn't here in 2016. Ray and Christy were, and the three of you and the rest of us collaboratively were all part of what happened in the general. So we're all on the hook here. You were elected as a recorder by the people, and you have an elections function. Ultimately, that falls to us. And so, I mean, when we ask the questions of you, our colleague, it's because we're afraid. We're nervous. We don't want to have happen again what happened just a couple of months ago, and we're just 15 days out. So my concerns are the same. This has been a great exercise. I've heard lots of words, and I don't mean this in at all a derisive way to you or to Christy or Ray. I'm still concerned about training. You know, if I take the numbers of 50 a day, twice a day, for the next 15 days, if we do that and we work through Sundays, do we have enough time? What's our communications plan? I'm not talking about just to let the board know, though it would be nice to have real-time communication. This is, what are the boots on the ground, the people that are going to make you look good and us look good? The 4,000? What do they have to go to? Because in some cases, these are people that are very experienced, but maybe more mature in years. In other cases, they may be new to the process. And for those people, a communications protocol, those clarified procedures are everything. And so my final comment with no response necessary is, I think you've heard those concerns. I believe you're on it. I would love to see the work product. If I were one of the people of the 4,000, I'd love to know what that operations plan is. You referenced your time as a Marine. You had pretty crystal clear operating procedures. Now, sometimes you had to improvise. And we hope that when people have to improvise on Elections Day, and they will, that they at least can fall back to a default position of an operations plan that has clarified process and procedures, that has a crystal clear communications plan, that they've been given the benefit of training. And I know that that's been something that Ray's heard it, Christie's heard it, you've heard it. I think that I've been pretty consistent in that. So I'm excited to see what happens in 15 days. I hope that we can stand up and celebrate a big win. This isn't about pointing fingers to me. It's about being successful in 15 days. I think that at this point in the process, we don't have another alternative but to stay united and to collaborate and to work together. I think that Barry Dunn and the team and our internal audit team have helped add extra eyes and articulate some of the concerns that I think we all share. The question is, what do we do? Devil's in the detail. And so I'm optimistic we're going to get there, but I'm still concerned about those three critical elements that have nothing to do with insight, material breach of contract, your words, ballot on demand. I'm focused on the 4,000 people that are going to help us be successful. Are they trained? Do we have a good communications plan? And how do they really assimilate those clarified process and procedures that we've talked about? So that's again, at the risk of reiterating yet again what I said first round of comments, that's where I am, and I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm excited. I'm anxious. It'd be unfair to suggest that I'm not. But we got our work cut out for us, and I'm at this point, the die has been cast, the team's in place, and there's a lot that rests on the three of you, this great team that we have before us. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barney. Through that, by that definition, you sound like you're an expectant father for the first time with all those things. So, but I think that very, very articulate. Mr. Gates.
Mr. Chair, before we, and I apologize for interrupting, Mr. Chair, I do want to address something really quickly here, because Mr. Barney and I have, I think Mr. Barney and I have we have a strong mutual respect, if not sort of a liking for each other's personalities, because I also like your personality, Mr. Barney. But you reminded me of something else that I learned when I was in the Marine Corps, and that is that every Marine is a rifleman first. And that's one of the reasons why I invited you all to come down to the training. That's one of the reasons why I'd love to see you and your staff come down and take a tour, look exactly at what we're doing, come in and do some of the eyes and ears on your own. I invite you to come down because I don't want you to just sit up here and be concerned. I'd love for you all to be involved. I'd love for your staff to be directly involved in the administration of this election as well. Because the confidence that I am exuding, the confidence that you've heard from our staff and the good performance that you've heard, the great communication in these conversations, while perhaps not formally written down with the documents of the same title, the esprit de corps that we're experiencing down at the Elections Department is really something to see. So I would invite you to come down, at very least to one of the trainings, so that you can rest some of those concerns, because I want to make sure that as a member of this team, right, that every single one of us can march forward, locked arm in arm, to make sure we have a successful election this fall. I want that as much as any of you do. And so that's one of the reasons I'm willing to extend that invitation.
Thank you. We don't need to go back and forth. Of the 4,000 people that you're onboarding, how many of those will be online versus in person? Just give me, it's just a percentage.
They're all online, so every board worker is required to take the online training, and every inspector and backup inspector is required to go to the in-person. So
that's my point. So my point is, me coming down and experiencing what a small percentage of the 4,000 are going to experience doesn't resolve my concern. And this is...
It's not a small percentage.
It is. If the majority are going to do online and not come down and be in person, I just want to see the communications plan. So yeah, we don't need to go back and forth. Adrian, we don't need to go back and forth.
I want to make sure that we are representing this properly so that we can waylay these fears. The small percentage is the folks who are going to be folding ballots and handing them to voters. Those are the folks that are getting the online training. They don't need to know all of the other specifics. And we don't need to spend all of these resources on a whole bunch of folks who are perfectly technical. Yeah. And so the idea...
I'm not talking about whether or not, and I'm going to cut you off because you cut me off. I'm not worried about whether they come down or not. I just want to see written protocols, clarified processes and procedures, your words. I want to see a communications plan. Because for the people that don't have the benefit of sitting in the esprit de corps, as you called it, in the energized election department, which is awesome, the people that sit in the 463, or what's the number? Let me get the number right. In the 463 polling places that never touch foot down here to shake your hand or see Christy or see Ray, I just want to know that they've got something, a security blanket that they can hold in their hand and look at and read and review. So in the moment of crisis, we hope it doesn't come, that they have some indication of what they need to do. That's all I'm asking for. That's part of the training. Some will be in person, most will be online. I'm okay with that. I think that's great. It's a good use of resources. But I'm talking about the follow-up resources that will help them be prepared in the moment of crisis. And we saw it in 2016. You made great points of that in the election, and you had good points in many cases. We saw it again in the primary election. I don't think that our capable audit team here has articulated anything that you haven't seen or thought of, but they're maybe suggesting a different way to go about it. This isn't about who gets to control the outcome of who made the suggestion. It's just a successful election 15 days from now. Training, communication, and clarified processes and procedures. Again, your words. I just want something. We're old school. We're going to waste paper. Put something in their hands, and if you can give me that, then I will sleep better, I promise. That's it.
I think we're going to move on to Mr. Gates's last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to the whole audit team in the Elections Department for great work here. Again, to the point that Mr. Barney made about that moment of crisis. So when I asked you about how you're able to handle 3 times as many voters at the same number of polling places, you focused on the fact that, you know, the new system that you have and the ability to run sort of multiple lines. So I want to be very clear then, if we do, because we may have wireless connectivity issues, if we have those issues, will we have a paper backup at every polling place if the wireless goes down?
We have several layers of backup at every polling place. The site books have an offline mode that will allow them to continue to work, issue regular ballots, and print envelopes, provisional envelopes in that case, so that we can get everybody going through. Because if we're offline at one particular polling place, we've got to look to that. We also have a completely offline, that is no connectivity and no power paper backup. So we've got several layers of contingency built into our system. I don't think we have a zombie apocalypse version, but we'd have bigger concerns at that point.
Okay, so again, we will not have someone, when somebody shows up at the door at 6 a.m., even if the power's off and the wireless is not working, they'll be able to vote. Is that what you're saying?
That was also true in August, because our insight voting capacity, which is usually reserved for folks that require ADA, sort of folks with disabilities, that voting machine was available at every single one of our voting sites in August. So there's never been a time where we weren't able to accommodate voters. Some voters choose not to use those options, but we've always been open.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. So as we bring this to a close, to Mr. Barney's point, right on time, thank you. Great leadership by the chairman. I think we need just to go back to one overriding principle, and that overriding principle really is the linchpin here. And that is that it's our job as a board to make sure we're providing every resource to you that we can. At our Canvas meeting shortly after the primary, I went through an array of every funding protocol that was given to you. You said it was not a resource issue. This is the first time we've heard that you'll need additional resources. I don't know if those additional resources financial resources will need to be done prior to the election. But when you say that, I think Mr. Gates had pause for good reason, so we'll want to learn more about that. But lastly, and most importantly, I think what we saw as a board after this last election was that we needed to get internal and external auditors, very capable auditors, to look at this so nothing could be missed. We've provided that. We've provided, I think, as a summary of all of my colleagues, including Mr. Gardo on the phone, we've provided you everything we can within our authority, without overstepping your bounds, you are a duly elected officer of Maricopa County. We cannot come in and run elections for you. So barring that, we believe we've given you everything we can to make sure that that election will be successful in November. We're hopeful if we can still be a resource in any way. We're happy to, as well as both auditing teams, and we will hope for a great outcome on November 6th. With that, I'm going to ask for a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Okay, we are now in executive session.